10 years after my family disowned me for being a failure, I returned home for my father's funeral wearing a simple black dress from Target. My siblings James and Susan whispered behind my back about how I still looked poor and unsuccessful. When the lawyer began reading Dad's will, their smug expressions turned to shock as he announced I was inheriting an equal share of the family business. What they didn't know was that while they had been running the company into bankruptcy, I had built a tech empire worth over $50 million. I had come home not to claim my inheritance, but to save the family business they had destroyed. Before we dive into my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you have ever felt like the black sheep of your family, hit that like button. You are not alone. I am Amanda Thompson, and for 10 years I have been living as a ghost in my family's memory. When I left my hometown of Cedar Falls at 22, I was branded as the irresponsible daughter who abandoned her family legacy to chase impossible dreams. To them, I was the college dropout who couldn't handle the pressure of running Thompson Construction, the third-generation family business that had built half the commercial buildings in our small Ohio town. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October while I was reviewing quarterly projections in my corner office on the 37th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. My assistant Jennifer knocked softly on my glass door before entering with an expression I had never seen before. "Ms. Thompson, I have your brother James on line too," she said quietly. "He says it's about your father." I had not spoken to James in 3 years, not since our last argument about my absence from family holidays. The sound of his voice, deeper now and strained with exhaustion, immediately transported me back to a world I had worked so hard to leave behind. "Amanda, Dad's gone," he said without preamble. "Heart attack yesterday evening. The funeral is Saturday." I felt my chest tighten as I processed the words. Despite everything that had happened between us, Robert Thompson had been my hero once. The man who taught me to read blueprints when I was 8, who showed me how to calculate load-bearing requirements, who believed I could run Thompson Construction better than anyone. "I'll be there," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Will you?" James asked, skepticism clear in his tone. "Because you've said that before." He was referring to the past 3 family emergencies I had missed due to business commitments. My grandmother's funeral 2 years ago, when I was negotiating a merger in Singapore. My cousin's wedding last spring, when I was launching our European expansion. Each absence had been used as further evidence of my selfishness and detachment from family values. "I'll be there, James," I repeated, already mentally rearranging my schedule. The drive from Cleveland Hopkins Airport to Cedar Falls took 2 hours through October countryside that looked exactly as I remembered. Rolling hills covered in red and gold leaves, farmhouses with white picket fences, small towns with water towers proudly displaying their founding dates. It was beautiful in a way that New York never was, but it also felt suffocating after a decade of boundless possibilities. Cedar Falls had a population of 12,000 people, most of whom had known each other since childhood. The Thompson family had been prominent since my great-grandfather started the construction company in 1953. We built the high school, the library, the medical center, and dozens of the commercial buildings that formed the backbone of the local economy. My childhood had been spent on construction sites, learning the trade from my father and grandfather. By 16, I could operate heavy machinery, read architectural plans, and calculate material costs faster than most college-educated engineers. Everyone assumed I would take over the business eventually, probably after marrying someone appropriate from one of the other established families. But I had always felt restless in Cedar Falls, hungry for challenges that extended beyond city limits. When I received a full scholarship to study business at Northwestern, my parents were proud but nervous. When I started talking about internships in Chicago and job opportunities in New York, they became worried. When I finally left the construction business to pursue a career in corporate consulting, they felt betrayed. The Thompson family home sat on 5 acres on the outskirts of town, a sprawling colonial revival that my grandfather had built as a showcase for the company's capabilities. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I could see people moving around inside through the large windows. Cars lined the street, indicating that the informal gathering of friends and relatives that always preceded our family funerals was already underway. I had deliberately worn the most modest outfit I owned, a simple black dress from Target that I had purchased specifically for this occasion. My usual wardrobe of designer suits and expensive accessories would have sent the wrong message to people who were already convinced of my vanity and materialism. The goal was to blend in, to avoid creating drama that would overshadow my father's funeral. Susan answered the door before I could knock, her face a careful mask of composed grief. My younger sister had always been the family diplomat, skilled at managing conflicts and maintaining appearances. At 31, she looked exactly like our mother had at the same age, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of understated elegance that comes from never having to worry about money. "Amanda," she said, embracing me with the kind of hug that looked genuine to observers but felt performative to participants. "I'm so glad you made it." The house was filled with the familiar faces of my childhood, people who had known me since I was born but who now regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Mrs. Henderson from the bank, who had always asked about my grades. Mr. Peterson from the hardware store, who had supplied materials for countless Thompson construction projects. My high school English teacher, Mrs. Walsh, who had encouraged my writing and probably blamed herself for my eventual departure. "Amanda Thompson," said my father's business partner, Frank Martinez, approaching with the confident stride of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "I heard you were living in New York now. How's the big city treating you?" Frank had been my father's closest friend and collaborator for 20 years. He was also the person most likely to take control of Thompson Construction if my siblings proved incapable of managing it effectively. His interest in my current circumstances was not purely social. "It's been challenging but rewarding," I replied diplomatically. "I'm sorry for your loss too, Frank. I know how close you and Dad were." "Your father talked about you often," he said, studying my face for reactions. "He worried about you being so far from family, especially when you stopped visiting." The implied criticism was subtle but clear. Frank, like most people in Cedar Falls, believed that family obligations should take precedence over personal ambitions. My absence from family gatherings had been interpreted as evidence of selfishness rather than professional dedication. James appeared at my shoulder, looking older and more weathered than I remembered. My older brother had always been handsome in a rugged, outdoorsy way, but now his face showed the stress of trying to maintain a business he had never fully understood. He had married his high school sweetheart, Karen, and they had 2 young children who were currently running around the house with their cousins. "Amanda, we need to talk," he said quietly. "Can we step outside?" We walked to the back patio, where I had spent countless summer evenings as a child. The view of the pond and the woods beyond had been my sanctuary during difficult teenage years. Now it felt like a relic from someone else's life. "I want you to know that Dad never stopped hoping you would come back," James began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Even after you stopped calling regularly, even after you missed Grandma's funeral, he kept saying that someday you would remember where you belonged." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I had experienced during our last conversation 3 years ago. James had a talent for making me feel guilty about choices that I knew were right for my life. "I never forgot where I came from, James," I said carefully. "But I couldn't stay here and be happy. You know that." "What I know is that Dad spent the last 2 years of his life wondering if he had failed as a father," James replied, his anger starting to show. "He blamed himself for not being able to keep the family together. Do you have any idea how that affected him?" The accusation hit its intended target. Whatever else had happened between us, I had never wanted to hurt my father. The possibility that my absence had contributed to his unhappiness was a burden I would carry forever. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "I never wanted Dad to feel that way." James studied my face for a moment, perhaps recognizing genuine remorse. His expression softened slightly, but the underlying tension remained. "The business is struggling, Amanda," he admitted. "Has been for the past 3 years. We lost 2 major contracts because of delays and cost overruns. Frank thinks we might need to sell some assets just to stay afloat." This was not surprising news. Even during my brief visit, I had noticed signs of financial strain. The company trucks in the driveway were older models with visible wear. The house, while still beautiful, showed signs of deferred maintenance. Susan's clothes were stylish but not expensive. James himself looked like someone carrying the weight of problems he could not solve. What happened? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Dad got sick 2 years ago, James explained. First the diabetes, then the heart problems. He couldn't work the long hours anymore, couldn't personally oversee every project the way he used to. We tried to pick up the slack, but we didn't have his experience or his relationships with clients. This was the inevitable result of a family business that had relied too heavily on one person's expertise and reputation. Robert Thompson had been a master craftsman and a skilled businessman, but he had never developed systems that could function without his direct involvement. When his health declined, the entire operation began to deteriorate. Susan and I have been doing our best, James continued, but we both know we're not equipped to run a construction company. Susan's background is in marketing, and I've spent most of my adult life working in Dad's shadow, never really learning to make independent decisions. The honesty in his admission surprised me. James had always projected confidence, even when he was clearly out of his depth. For him to acknowledge his limitations meant that the situation was worse than I had imagined. What about Frank? I asked. He has the experience. Frank wants to buy us out, James said grimly. He's made several offers over the past year, each one lower than the last. Dad refused to even consider selling, but now. The implication was clear. With Robert Thompson gone, Frank Martinez would likely position himself as the logical successor to control the company. James and Susan would be bought out for whatever Frank was willing to pay, probably a fraction of what Thompson Construction had once been worth. We were interrupted by Karen calling from the house that dinner was being served. As we walked back inside, I found myself analyzing the situation with the strategic thinking that had made me successful in corporate consulting. Thompson Construction was a classic case of a family business in transition, lacking the leadership and systems necessary to survive the founder's departure. Without significant intervention, it would either be sold at a loss or simply fail. The funeral service the next morning was held at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where 3 generations of Thompsons had been baptized, confirmed, and married. The church was packed with people whose lives had been touched by my father's work and generosity. Contractors, suppliers, city officials, and ordinary families who had lived in houses built by Thompson Construction. Father Mackenzie delivered a eulogy that captured my father's essential character: his dedication to quality craftsmanship, his loyalty to his employees, his commitment to the community. As I listened to story after story about my father's impact on other people's lives, I felt both pride and regret. Pride in being his daughter, regret that I had spent so little time with him during his final years. The burial took place at Cedar Falls Cemetery, where 4 generations of Thompsons were laid to rest under massive oak trees that had been planted by the town's founders. As we stood around the grave, I noticed how small our family had become. My grandparents were gone, my father was gone, and I had isolated myself from the siblings who remained. The most difficult moment came when James and Susan each spoke about our father's legacy. James talked about the buildings that would stand for generations as monuments to Robert Thompson's skill and integrity. Susan spoke about the values he had instilled in his children: hard work, honesty, loyalty to family and community. When it was my turn to speak, I struggled to find words that would honor my father without sounding hypocritical. Finally, I simply said that he had taught me to believe in myself and to never settle for anything less than excellence. It was true, even if I had applied those lessons in ways he had never expected. After the burial, we returned to the house for the traditional gathering where people shared memories and offered condolences. It was during this reception that I began to understand the full scope of the challenges facing my family. Frank Martinez cornered me near the buffet table, his approach casual but purposeful. He had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to assess my intentions regarding the family business. "Amanda, I hope you'll consider staying in Cedar Falls for a while," he said, helping himself to a piece of my aunt's famous apple pie. "Your family needs support during this difficult time." "I plan to stay through the will reading on Monday," I replied carefully. "After that, I'll need to return to work." Of course, Frank nodded understandingly. "Big responsibilities in New York, I'm sure. But you might want to think about the responsibilities you have here too." The subtle pressure was typical of Frank's communication style. He never made direct demands, but he was skilled at making people feel guilty for not meeting his expectations. "James tells me the business is struggling," I said, deciding to address the situation directly. "That must be difficult for everyone." Frank's expression became more serious. "Your father was a brilliant man, but he never planned adequately for succession. James and Susan are good people, but they don't have the background to run a construction company. I've offered to buy them out at fair market value, but they seem reluctant to accept reality." "What's fair market value for a company that's losing money?" I asked. Frank studied my face carefully before answering. "In the current market, probably around $200,000 for their share of the assets. The real value is in the client relationships and the Thompson name, which I've built alongside your father for 20 years. I nodded neutrally, but my mind was calculating rapidly. Even in its current weakened state, Thompson Construction owned valuable real estate, equipment, and intellectual property that was worth far more than Frank's offer. He was essentially proposing to acquire the company for a fraction of its potential value. "That's generous of you to offer them anything," I said diplomatically. "I believe in taking care of people," Frank replied. "Your father would have wanted his children to be financially secure, even if they can't continue his work." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Frank subtly probing for information about my intentions while positioning himself as the family's protector and logical successor. By the time we parted, I understood that he viewed my siblings as obstacles to be managed rather than partners to be respected. Later that evening, after most of the guests had departed, I sat with James and Susan in our father's study. The room was exactly as I remembered it, filled with industry publications, project photographs, and the massive oak desk where he had managed the business for 30 years. "Frank talked to me about buying out the company," I said without preamble. Susan and James exchanged glances, confirming that this was a topic they had discussed extensively. "He's made the offer several times," Susan admitted. "Each time for less money than the previous offer." "Dad refused to even consider it," James added. "He said Frank was trying to steal the company he had spent his life building." "What do you two want to do?" I asked. The question hung in the air for a long moment. Finally, Susan spoke. "Honestly, Amanda, we're in over our heads. We've been trying to keep things together since Dad got sick, but we're losing money every month. We have employee payroll to meet, insurance payments, equipment loans. If we don't do something soon, we'll lose everything anyway." James nodded in agreement. "Frank's offer isn't generous, but it would give us enough money to pay off the debts and have something left over to start fresh. Maybe that's the smartest choice." I could see the defeat in their eyes, the resignation of people who had tried their best and failed. They had spent 2 years fighting to preserve our father's legacy, but they lacked the skills and resources necessary to succeed. "Before you make any final decisions," I said carefully, "you should know that Dad left me an equal share of the business in his will." Both of my siblings stared at me in shock. This was clearly news to them. "That's impossible," James said. "You left the business 10 years ago. You haven't been involved in any decisions." "Apparently Dad saw things differently," I replied. "Mr. Henderson called me yesterday to confirm that I'm inheriting a full third of Thompson Construction." The implications of this revelation began to sink in. Instead of Frank negotiating with 2 inexperienced siblings, he would now have to deal with 3 equal partners, one of whom had a business background and no emotional attachment to quick resolution. Susan was the first to understand the strategic implications. "You could block any sale that James and I agree to." "I could," I confirmed. "But I'm more interested in exploring whether the company can be saved." James leaned forward, sudden hope replacing his earlier resignation. "Do you think it's possible?" "I think it's worth investigating," I said. "But I would need complete access to the financial records, employee contracts, client agreements, everything. And I would need both of you to be honest with me about exactly how bad things are." That's when everything changed. Over the next hour, James and Susan laid out the full scope of Thompson Construction's problems. The company was hemorrhaging money due to poor project management, cost overruns, and client dissatisfaction. They had lost 3 major contracts in the past year because of missed deadlines and quality issues. Employee morale was terrible because paychecks had been delayed twice in recent months. But as I listened to their litany of problems, I also heard opportunities. The construction industry in Ohio was experiencing a boom due to new industrial development and population growth. Thompson Construction still had valuable assets, including prime real estate, modern equipment, and a brand name that commanded respect in the region. Most importantly, they had a skilled workforce that could deliver quality results under competent management. What if I told you there was a way to save the company and make it profitable again? I asked. Susan looked skeptical. How? We don't have the capital to invest in new equipment or marketing. What if the capital wasn't a problem? I pressed. What if someone was willing to invest whatever was necessary to modernize operations, retrain employees, and rebuild client relationships? James and Susan exchanged another glance, this one filled with cautious hope rather than resignation. Are you talking about some kind of business loan? James asked. I smiled for the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls. I'm talking about something much better than that. The will reading was scheduled for Monday morning at 10 o'clock in the offices of Henderson, Walsh and Associates, the law firm that had handled Thompson family legal matters for 3 generations. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of habit and partly to observe the dynamics before my siblings arrived. The law offices occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian mansion on Main Street, with tall windows that overlooked the town square where farmers' markets and festivals had been held since the 1800s. Mr. Henderson had been my father's attorney and friend for over 20 years, a distinguished man in his 60s who commanded respect throughout the county. James and Susan arrived together, accompanied by Karen and Susan's husband David, a quiet accountant who worked for the county government. They were dressed in their best clothes, somber expressions masking what I suspected was nervous anticipation about their financial future. Frank Martinez entered a few minutes later, his presence unexpected but not surprising. As my father's business partner, he probably had legitimate reasons to attend, though I suspected his motivations were more strategic than sentimental. Mr. Henderson began with the standard legal formalities, reading sections about charitable donations and personal effects. Dad had left his fishing equipment to his oldest friend, his collection of vintage tools to the local trade school, and modest cash gifts to longtime employees. Then came the moment that would change everything. To my children James, Susan, and Amanda Thompson, I leave equal shares of Thompson Construction Company, including all assets, properties, contracts, and obligations, Mr. Henderson read in his measured legal tone. The silence that followed was deafening. James literally dropped the pen he had been holding, the small sound echoing in the quiet room like a gunshot. Susan's face went completely white, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. That's impossible, James finally managed. Amanda hasn't been involved in the business for 10 years. Nevertheless, Mr. Henderson continued calmly, your father was very specific about this provision. He included a letter explaining his reasoning, which I am authorized to read. He opened a sealed envelope and began reading in my father's familiar voice, translated through the lawyer's professional delivery. To my children, I have watched each of you grow into capable adults with different strengths and different paths. James, you have shown loyalty and dedication to our family traditions. Susan, you have demonstrated grace and wisdom in managing family relationships. Amanda, you have shown courage and independence in pursuing your own vision of success. I felt tears forming as I heard my father's words, acknowledgement I had never expected to receive. I believe that Thompson Construction's future depends on combining all of these qualities. The business needs James's understanding of our methods, Susan's people skills, and Amanda's strategic thinking. I pray that my death will bring you together rather than drive you further apart. The letter continued with specific instructions about how decisions should be made and conflicts resolved, but I could barely focus on the details. My father had understood me better than I had realized, had valued my choices even when he disagreed with them. Frank Martinez was the first to speak after Mr. Henderson finished reading. Robert never mentioned changing his will, he said. his tone carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with calculation. Mr. Thompson updated his will 6 months ago, the lawyer replied. He was quite deliberate about these provisions. James found his voice, though it came out strained and higher than usual. Amanda, you can't seriously expect to take an equal share after being gone for 10 years. The will is clear, I replied calmly. Dad wanted all 3 of us to inherit equally. But you don't even live here anymore, Susan protested, her voice rising with emotion. You have your own life in New York. What could you possibly want with a construction company? This was the moment I had been anticipating and dreading. The moment when I would have to reveal truths that would fundamentally alter our family dynamics forever. You're right that I have my own life, I said carefully. But you're wrong about what that life looks like. I reached into my briefcase and removed a folder containing documents I had prepared for this conversation. For the past 10 years, I've been building something that started as a small consulting firm and grew into something much larger. James leaned forward, his expression skeptical. Amanda, we know you work for some consulting company. That's not the same as running a construction business. I don't work for a consulting company, James. I own one. Actually, I own several companies now. I handed each of them a copy of the summary I had prepared, watching their faces as they processed the information. Thompson Strategic Solutions had grown from a one-person operation to a firm with 400 employees across 6 offices. We specialized in helping traditional industries modernize their operations using technology and data analytics. This can't be right, Susan said, staring at the financial statements. These numbers are enormous. Last year we generated $87 million in revenue, I confirmed. We've been profitable every year since our 3rd year of operation. Frank Martinez was studying the documents with the intensity of someone who understood their implications. You're saying you've built a multimillion-dollar business in 10 years. I'm saying I've built exactly the kind of business that could help Thompson Construction modernize and become profitable again, I replied. The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed this revelation. The woman they had dismissed as a failure, the daughter who had abandoned her family responsibilities, the sister who couldn't handle the pressure of a family business, had actually built something far more successful than anything the Thompson family had ever achieved. James was the first to recover from the shock, but his response surprised me. Instead of congratulations or curiosity about my success, his voice carried anger and accusation. So this is some kind of game to you, he said bitterly. You let us struggle for years, let Dad worry about whether the business would survive, all while you were becoming rich in New York. It wasn't a game, James, I replied, feeling the familiar defensive reaction that family conflicts always triggered. I tried to maintain contact, but every conversation became an argument about my choices. Because your choices hurt people, Susan interjected, her earlier shock giving way to years of accumulated resentment. Do you have any idea what the last 2 years were like? Watching Dad get sicker while worrying about the business failing. Trying to keep employees paid while clients complained about missed deadlines. The accusations stung because they contained elements of truth. I had built walls between myself and my family, had chosen professional success over personal relationships, had allowed pride and stubbornness to prevent me from offering help when it was desperately needed. You're right, I admitted. I should have reached out sooner. I should have offered to help when Dad got sick. Offered help. James's voice cracked with emotion. Amanda, we didn't need your help. We needed you. We needed our sister to come home and be part of the family instead of treating us like strangers. The conversation was spiraling toward the same painful territory that had driven me away 10 years earlier. But this time, I was determined not to let hurt feelings and miscommunication destroy our chance to heal our relationships and save our father's legacy. I know I made mistakes, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. I know I hurt all of you by staying away. But I'm here now, and I want to help fix what's broken. Frank Martinez chose that moment to insert himself into our family drama. This is all very touching, he said with barely concealed impatience, but it doesn't change the fundamental problem. Thompson Construction is losing money every month. Good intentions won't pay the bills or satisfy angry clients. He was right about the urgency of the situation, but his tone suggested that he viewed my return as an inconvenience rather than an opportunity. Frank's right about the timeline. I agreed. But he's wrong about the solutions. Thompson Construction doesn't need to be sold. It needs to be rebuilt. With what money? Susan asked pragmatically. We've already borrowed against every asset we own. With my money, I said simply. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. James and Susan stared at me as if I had suggested something impossible, while Frank's expression shifted to something approaching alarm. What exactly are you proposing? James asked cautiously. I'm proposing to invest whatever is necessary to modernize Thompson Construction's operations, retrain the workforce, upgrade equipment, and rebuild client relationships, I explained. In exchange for management control and a plan to make the company profitable within 18 months. Frank leaned forward, his businessman instincts fully engaged. How much money are we talking about? Whatever it takes, I replied. I estimate somewhere between $5 and $10 million for complete modernization. The number seemed to physically impact my siblings. Susan actually gasped, while James sat back in his chair as if he had been pushed. You have $10 million. Susan whispered. I have access to significantly more than that, I confirmed. Thompson Strategic Solutions has lines of credit that most companies would envy. More importantly, I have 10 years of experience helping traditional businesses modernize successfully. Frank's expression had shifted from alarm to calculation. A Thompson Construction backed by millions of dollars in investment capital would be a very different entity than the struggling company he had been planning to acquire at bargain prices. This is a very generous offer, Amanda, he said carefully, but construction is a specialized industry. Your experience in consulting might not translate to building roads and commercial structures. You're absolutely right, Frank, I agreed. That's why I would need to rely heavily on experienced people like you and James to handle the operational aspects while I focus on modernizing business systems and financial management. It was a diplomatic response that acknowledged his expertise while positioning myself as the strategic leader. Frank was smart enough to recognize both the offer and the implicit threat. He could either work with me or find himself competing against a well-funded rival. Mr. Henderson had been listening to our discussion with the patient attention of someone who had mediated many family business disputes. Before any major decisions are made, he interjected gently, you might want to review the complete terms of your father's will. He handed us additional documents that outlined specific provisions for how the business should be managed and how conflicts should be resolved. Dad had anticipated exactly this kind of situation and had created a framework for decision-making that required consensus among the three siblings for major changes. According to these provisions, Mr. Henderson explained, any significant change in business operations or ownership structure requires agreement from at least 2 of the 3 inheritors. The implications were clear. Frank could not simply buy out James and Susan without my consent. Similarly, I could not impose my modernization plan without at least one of my siblings agreeing to support it. This gives each of you veto power over decisions you fundamentally disagree with, the lawyer continued. Your father hoped it would force you to work together rather than allowing any one person to dominate. James and Susan exchanged glances, and I could see them processing the shift in power dynamics. They were no longer desperate sellers negotiating from weakness. They had options, including the option to partner with their newly wealthy sister. I need time to think about this, James said finally. This is all happening too fast. Of course, I agreed. This is a major decision that will affect all of our lives. Take whatever time you need. But Frank Martinez was clearly uncomfortable with delay. Time is a luxury we don't have, he pointed out. Every day Thompson Construction continues losing money makes the situation worse. Employees are already looking for other jobs. Clients are cancelling contracts. He was applying pressure, trying to force a quick decision before my siblings had time to fully consider their options. It was a classic negotiating tactic, but it revealed his anxiety about losing control of the situation. Actually, Frank, I said calmly, I disagree. The first step in any turnaround is stabilizing operations long enough to implement systematic changes. I can provide bridge funding immediately to cover payroll and essential expenses while we develop a comprehensive plan." This was news to everyone in the room, including my siblings. The idea that someone could simply write checks to cover a failing company's expenses was outside their experience. "You would do that?" Susan asked. "Even before we agree to anything?" "Family first," I replied, using a phrase our father had repeated throughout our childhood. "Thompson Construction won't fail on my watch, regardless of what we ultimately decide about the future." The meeting concluded with agreements to reconvene later in the week after everyone had time to review the legal documents and consider their options. As we prepared to leave, Frank approached me one more time. "Amanda, I hope you understand that saving Thompson Construction will require more than just money," he said in a tone that might have been meant as friendly advice but sounded more like a warning. "This is a tough business with razor-thin margins and demanding clients. Good intentions and financial resources don't guarantee success." "You're absolutely right, Frank," I replied with a smile that probably didn't reach my eyes. "That's why I've spent the last 10 years learning how to turn around struggling businesses. Thompson Construction will be my most personal project, but it won't be my first." As I walked to my rental car, I reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed in just a few hours. This morning, James and Susan had been resigned to selling their inheritance at whatever price Frank was willing to pay. Now they were considering a partnership that could potentially restore Thompson Construction to profitability and preserve our father's legacy. But I also understood that money and business expertise were not enough to heal the emotional wounds that had kept our family apart for a decade. James and Susan still saw me as the sister who had abandoned them when they needed support. I still felt the sting of being dismissed as irresponsible and selfish when I had actually been building something remarkable. The real work of rebuilding Thompson Construction would require rebuilding our family relationships first. And that would be far more challenging than any business turnaround I had ever attempted. That evening, I drove to the Thompson Construction offices for the first time in 10 years. The building was a modest single-story structure on the edge of town, with a parking lot full of pickup trucks and equipment trailers. Dad had always been proud that the company operated from the same location where his father had started the business 60 years earlier. The offices were dark, but I used the key that James had given me to let myself inside. The familiar smell of blueprint paper and coffee brought back memories of summer afternoons when I had helped Dad with filing and basic office tasks. The walls were covered with photographs of completed projects, testimonials from satisfied clients, and awards from industry organizations. I spent 2 hours reviewing financial records, employee files, and current project documentation. The picture that emerged was both worse and better than I had expected. Worse because the financial losses were even greater than James had admitted. Better because the underlying fundamentals of the business remained strong. Thompson Construction still employed 37 people, most of whom had been with the company for more than 5 years. The equipment was older but well maintained. The current projects, while behind schedule, were all technically feasible and could be completed profitably with proper management. Most importantly, the Thompson name still commanded respect in the regional construction industry. Clients might be frustrated with recent performance, but they remembered decades of quality work and fair dealing. That reputation was an asset that could not be easily quantified but was worth millions in terms of future business potential. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a framed photograph on my father's desk that I had not seen earlier. It showed the 3 of us children at a construction site, probably taken when I was about 12 years old. We were all wearing hard hats and tool belts, grinning at the camera with the pride of kids who believed they were doing important work. Looking at that photograph, I realized that my father's decision to include me in his will was not just about business succession. It was about family reconciliation, about bringing his children back together around a shared purpose that had once united us. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to my hotel room. Susan knocked on my door at 8:30, looking determined but nervous. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street and an expression I remembered from our childhood when she had something important to discuss. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," she began without preamble as we sat at the small table by the window. "About modernizing the company and making it profitable again." "And?" I prompted, sensing that she had reached some kind of decision. "And I think Dad would want us to try," she said simply. "He spent his whole life building that company. If there's a chance to save it, we owe it to him to take that chance." I felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Susan's support would make everything possible, from implementing operational changes to managing James's inevitable resistance to outside interference. "There's something else," Susan continued, her voice becoming more hesitant. "I owe you an apology. We all do. Yesterday in that lawyer's office, when we found out how successful you'd become, my first reaction was anger instead of pride. I should have been celebrating my sister's achievements instead of resenting them." The unexpected apology caught me off guard, and I felt tears forming for the second time in 2 days. "Susan, you don't need to apologize. I understand why you were angry." "Maybe, but it wasn't fair," she insisted. "You left Cedar Falls because you needed something we couldn't give you here. You built something amazing, and instead of being proud of you, we spent 10 years being bitter about your success." This was the conversation I had hoped for but never expected to have. Susan had always been the family mediator, but she had also been the one most hurt by my departure because we had been so close as children. "I should have found a way to stay connected," I admitted. "I should have shared my success with you instead of hiding it." "Why did you hide it?" she asked. "Were you embarrassed by us?" The question went to the heart of our family's dysfunction, and answering it honestly would require me to acknowledge painful truths about pride, fear, and the different ways people define success. "I was afraid you would think I was showing off," I said finally. Every time we talked, the conversation became about how I had abandoned my responsibilities here. "I thought if you knew how well I was doing, it would make that worse." Susan nodded slowly, understanding the logic even if she disagreed with the conclusion. "So instead of dealing with the conflict, you just stopped communicating." "It seemed easier at the time," I admitted. "But it wasn't fair to any of us." We spent the next hour talking about the past decade, sharing stories about our respective lives and slowly rebuilding the connection that had been severed by miscommunication and hurt feelings. Susan told me about her struggles with infertility, her husband David's quiet strength, and her fears about Thompson Construction's future. I told her about the challenges of building a business from scratch, the loneliness of success without family to share it, and my regrets about missing so many important family moments. By the time she left, we had established the foundation for a real partnership, both personal and professional. Susan would support my plan to modernize Thompson Construction, and I would make sure that any changes respected the company's traditions and protected the employees who had remained loyal during difficult times. The hard part would be convincing James. James proved to be a much tougher negotiation than I had anticipated. When Susan and I approached him the next day with our proposal for modernizing Thompson Construction, his initial response was immediate and uncompromising rejection. "Absolutely not," he said, setting down his coffee mug with enough force to rattle the kitchen table. "I'm not going to let my sister waltz back into town and take over Dad's company just because she got lucky in New York." We were meeting at James and Karen's house, a modest ranch-style home that they had purchased 5 years earlier with hopes of starting a family. The living room was decorated with Karen's quilts and James's hunting trophies, creating an atmosphere that reflected their deep roots in Cedar Falls and traditional values. "James, I'm not trying to take over anything," I said, keeping my voice calm despite his accusatory tone. "I'm offering to invest in saving the company that Dad spent his life building." "By making yourself the boss," he shot back. "By turning Thompson Construction into some kind of high-tech consulting firm instead of the family business it's always been." Karen, who had been quietly listening from the kitchen, brought in a plate of homemade cookies and sat down beside her husband. She had always been a stabilizing influence on James, and I hoped her presence might help moderate his reactions. "James, honey," she said gently, "maybe you should hear Amanda out before deciding." "I've heard enough," James replied, but his tone softened slightly in deference to his wife's request. "Amanda disappears for 10 years, builds some fancy company, and now wants to come back and fix everything that's wrong with our lives. It's insulting." Susan leaned forward, her diplomatic skills fully engaged. "James, nobody's trying to insult you. We're trying to save the company before it's too late. Save it from what? James demanded. From me. From my incompetence. This was the real issue, I realized. James's resistance was not primarily about business strategy or family dynamics. It was about his deep-seated fear that accepting my help would confirm his own inadequacy as a leader and businessman. James, I said carefully, this has nothing to do with competence. You've kept the company alive during the most difficult period in its history. Dad got sick, the economy changed, and you held things together under impossible circumstances. But not well enough, he said bitterly. Not well enough to prevent us from losing money every month. Not well enough to keep our best employees from looking for other jobs. Not well enough to maintain the reputation Dad spent 30 years building. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. James had spent 2 years trying to fill our father's shoes, and the weight of responsibility had been crushing him. Every failed project, every disappointed client, every delayed paycheck had reinforced his sense of personal failure. You know what the worst part is? He continued, his composure finally cracking. I used to think I understood this business. I grew up on construction sites just like you did. I learned how to read blueprints, how to manage crews, how to estimate costs. But none of that prepared me for the business side. The contracts, the insurance, the client relationships, the financial planning. Dad made it look easy, but he never taught me how to do those things. This was exactly the kind of honest admission that made productive conversation possible. James was acknowledging his limitations without admitting defeat, creating space for collaborative solutions. That's why we need to work together, I said. You understand construction in ways that I never will. But I understand business systems and financial management in ways that could help Thompson Construction become more efficient and profitable. Karen spoke up for the first time since bringing the cookies. James, what if you could focus on the parts of the business you're good at while Amanda handles the parts that have been causing problems? It's not that simple, Karen, James replied, but I could see him considering the possibility. The construction business isn't like other businesses. You can't just apply generic business principles and expect them to work. You're absolutely right, I agreed. That's why any changes would need to be developed in partnership with people who understand the industry. Nothing would be implemented without your approval and Frank's input. The mention of Frank Martinez brought a new complication to the conversation. James trusted Frank's judgment and relied on his experience, but he was also aware that Frank had his own agenda regarding Thompson Construction's future. Frank thinks we should sell, James said. He says the construction business is too volatile for small companies to survive long term. Frank wants to buy the company for a fraction of its value, Susan pointed out. His advice might not be entirely objective. This was a delicate moment. I needed to acknowledge Frank's expertise while questioning his motives, without appearing to attack someone that James considered a mentor and friend. Frank is absolutely right about the challenges facing small construction companies, I said diplomatically. But those challenges can be opportunities for companies that adapt effectively. The construction industry is being transformed by new technologies, new materials, and new client expectations. Thompson Construction could be ahead of that curve instead of behind it. I spent the next hour outlining specific modernization strategies that I had researched over the past 2 days. Project management software that could track costs and schedules in real time. Customer relationship management systems that could identify new business opportunities. Equipment monitoring technology that could reduce maintenance costs and prevent breakdowns. But the most important element of my proposal was not technological. It was organizational restructuring that would allow James to focus on field operations while I handled business development and financial management. Think of it as a partnership between equals, I explained. You would be responsible for project execution, crew management, and client relationships. I would handle contracts, financing, marketing, and strategic planning. Susan could manage human resources and community relations. James was quiet for a long time after I finished my presentation, clearly weighing the pros and cons of accepting help versus maintaining independence. Finally, Karen broke the silence. James, what would your father want you to do? She asked simply. The question cut straight to the emotional core of the decision. Robert Thompson had valued family loyalty above personal pride, had believed in collaboration over competition, and had always been willing to adapt when circumstances required change. Dad would want us to work together, James admitted reluctantly. But he would also want Thompson Construction to remain a family business with family values. So do I said sincerely. The goal is to preserve what Dad built while adapting to modern business realities. The Thompson name, the commitment to quality, the loyalty to employees and community. Those things would never change. By the end of the conversation, James had agreed to a 6-month trial period during which we would implement basic modernization measures while evaluating whether more extensive changes were justified. It was not the enthusiastic partnership I had hoped for, but it was enough to move forward. The next challenge was Frank Martinez, who requested a private meeting after learning about our family agreement. We met at his office, a well-appointed space in the same building that housed the Thompson Construction headquarters. Frank had decorated with photographs of major projects he had managed over the years, subtle reminders of his experience and accomplishments. "Amanda, I appreciate your desire to help your family," he began, settling behind his desk with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "But I'm concerned that you might not fully understand what you're getting into." "I'm listening," I replied, curious to hear his specific objections. "Thompson Construction is not a consulting firm or a technology company," Frank explained. "It's a relationship business built on trust, reputation, and decades of proven performance. Clients hire us because they know we'll deliver quality work on time and on budget. That reputation can be destroyed very quickly by well-intentioned changes that disrupt established procedures." This was a sophisticated argument that acknowledged my business expertise while questioning its relevance to the construction industry. Frank was positioning himself as the guardian of Thompson Construction's traditional values against the threat of reckless modernization. "You're absolutely right about the importance of client relationships," I agreed. "That's why any operational changes would be implemented gradually and with extensive input from experienced people like you." Frank leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Amanda, I've been thinking about your offer to invest millions of dollars in modernizing the company. That's an extraordinarily generous gesture, but it raises some practical questions." Such as what happens if the modernization doesn't work?" Frank replied. "What happens if Thompson Construction continues to lose money despite your investments? Are you prepared to lose $5 or $10 million to save a company that might not be salvageable?" The question was designed to highlight the financial risks while implying that Thompson Construction was probably beyond saving. Frank was suggesting that my emotional attachment to the family business was clouding my business judgment. "Frank, I've analyzed dozens of companies in similar situations," I said calmly. "Thompson Construction has fundamental strengths that make it an excellent candidate for successful turnaround. The real risk would be in not attempting to save it." "But surely you understand that your siblings would be devastated if your rescue attempt failed," Frank continued. "They would lose not only their inheritance but also their hopes for preserving their father's legacy. Wouldn't it be kinder to help them accept reality and move on with dignity?" This was Frank's most sophisticated argument yet. He was appealing to my concern for James and Susan's emotional well-being while positioning his buyout offer as the compassionate alternative to risky rescue attempts. "What exactly are you proposing, Frank?" I asked directly. "I'm proposing that you convince your siblings to accept my offer to purchase Thompson Construction," he said. "With your financial resources, you could supplement what I pay them and ensure they have enough money to start fresh without the burden of a struggling business." The proposal was clever. Frank would acquire Thompson Construction at below market prices while I would essentially subsidize the transaction by providing additional compensation to James and Susan. Frank would get the company he wanted while appearing to facilitate a family-friendly solution. "That's an interesting idea," I said neutrally. "But I think there's a better alternative." "Which is?" "Instead of buying out my siblings, you could become a partner in the modernized Thompson Construction," I proposed. "Your construction expertise combined with my business experience and financial resources could create something much more valuable than the current company." Frank's expression shifted slightly, revealing his discomfort with this unexpected counterproposal. He had expected me to either accept his buyout suggestion or reject it outright. A partnership offer required him to consider whether his long-term interests would be better served by collaboration or acquisition. Partnership arrangements can be complicated, Frank said carefully. Different management styles, different priorities, different visions for the company's future. They can also be extraordinarily successful when partners have complementary strengths, I replied. You understand construction operations better than I ever will. I understand business development and financial management better than most people in this industry. Together, we could build something remarkable. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Frank probing for weaknesses in my business plan while I outlined specific opportunities for growth and profitability. By the end of our meeting, Frank had agreed to review my detailed proposals before making any final decisions about his own future with Thompson Construction. But I left his office with the distinct impression that Frank Martinez was not ready to abandon his plans for acquiring the company. He would cooperate with our modernization efforts as long as they served his interests, but he would also be looking for opportunities to undermine our progress if we became too successful. The real test came 2 weeks later when Thompson Construction faced its first major challenge under our new management structure. One of our largest clients, Midwest Manufacturing, called an emergency meeting to discuss serious problems with a warehouse project that was already 6 weeks behind schedule and significantly over budget. The project had been James's responsibility, and the delays were primarily due to complications that he had struggled to manage effectively. Equipment breakdowns, weather delays, and coordination problems with subcontractors had turned what should have been a straightforward construction job into a potential disaster. If we don't get this project back on track immediately, the client's facilities manager told us bluntly, we'll have no choice but to terminate the contract and hire another company to finish the work. Such a termination would be catastrophic for Thompson Construction's reputation and finances. We would lose the remaining payments for completed work, face possible legal action for breach of contract, and suffer damage to our credibility that could cost us future business opportunities. James was clearly devastated by the client's ultimatum. This was exactly the kind of failure that had been haunting him for months, confirmation of his fears about his inadequacy as a project manager. "This is my fault," he said after the client representatives left. "I should have anticipated these problems. I should have had backup plans." "James, this is exactly why Dad wanted us to work together," I said firmly. "No one person can handle every aspect of a complex project. But together, we can solve this." I had been studying the warehouse project's problems for several days, analyzing the original timeline, reviewing subcontractor agreements, and identifying the critical path issues that were causing delays. The situation was serious but not hopeless. The key is to reorganize the work sequence to minimize weather dependencies while bringing in additional crews to work parallel shifts, I explained. It will cost more money upfront, but we can recover most of the additional expense by completing the project faster than the revised timeline. Frank Martinez, who had been notably quiet during the crisis, finally spoke up. "Amanda, that's a very optimistic assessment. Construction projects that fall this far behind schedule rarely recover without massive cost overruns." "You're right that recovery is difficult," I agreed. "But Thompson Construction has advantages that most companies don't have. We have the financial resources to invest in accelerated completion. We have the flexibility to bring in specialized crews from our network. And we have the client relationships necessary to negotiate reasonable modifications to the original contract." Over the next month, we implemented the most intensive project recovery effort in Thompson Construction's history. I negotiated with subcontractors to provide additional crews, arranged for expedited delivery of critical materials, and worked with the client to modify specifications that were causing unnecessary complications. James coordinated the field operations with a level of energy and focus that I had not seen since our childhood. Having a clear plan and adequate resources freed him to concentrate on what he did best: managing crews, solving technical problems, and ensuring quality workmanship. Susan handled communication with employees, vendors, and community stakeholders, making sure that everyone understood our commitment to completing the project successfully and maintaining Thompson Construction's reputation for reliability. The warehouse project was completed only 2 weeks behind the original schedule and within 5% of the original budget. More importantly, the client was so impressed with our recovery efforts that they offered us an additional contract for a larger facility. But the real victory was not financial. It was the restoration of confidence and pride that had been missing from Thompson Construction for years. Employees who had been updating their resumes began talking about long-term career opportunities. Subcontractors who had been concerned about our financial stability began proposing new partnerships. Clients who had been hesitant to award us new contracts began requesting proposals for upcoming projects. Frank Martinez was forced to acknowledge the success of our modernization efforts, though his congratulations carried undertones of surprise and reluctance. "I have to admit, Amanda, your approach to project management has been more effective than I expected," he said during our monthly review meeting. "The warehouse recovery was impressive." "Thank you, Frank," I replied. "But the real credit belongs to James and the crew who did the actual work. My contribution was just providing the resources and systems to support their efforts." It was an honest assessment that also served to reinforce James's value and expertise. I had learned that successful family business partnerships require constant attention to maintaining everyone's dignity and sense of contribution. 6 months after returning to Cedar Falls, I stood in my father's old office reviewing financial statements that told a remarkable story. Thompson Construction had returned to profitability ahead of our most optimistic projections. We had completed 8 major projects without significant delays or cost overruns. We had hired 12 new employees to handle increased business volume. Most importantly, we had rebuilt the reputation for excellence that had been the foundation of our father's success. James knocked on the door, his expression reflecting a mixture of pride and amazement that had become familiar over recent months. "Amanda, I just got off the phone with the school district," he said, barely containing his excitement. "They want us to bid on the new high school construction project. $15 million, 18-month timeline." The new high school would be the largest project in Thompson Construction's history, the kind of prestigious contract that established companies as major players in the regional construction industry. 6 months earlier, we would not have been considered qualified to handle such a project. "That's incredible news," I replied, feeling genuine excitement about the opportunity. "Do you think we're ready for something that large?" 6 months ago, I would have said no, James admitted. "But now, with the systems you've put in place and the team we've built, I think we can handle anything." This was the moment I had been working toward since returning to Cedar Falls. Not just financial success or business growth, but the restoration of confidence and family unity that had been missing for so many years. Susan joined us a few minutes later, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the biggest smile I had seen from her since our childhood. "I just heard about the high school project," she said, setting the bottle on Dad's desk. "I think this calls for a celebration." As we opened the champagne and toasted Thompson Construction's future, I reflected on how much had changed since that difficult day in the lawyer's office 6 months earlier. We had saved the family business, rebuilt our relationships, and created something even stronger than what our father had originally established. Frank Martinez appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he observed our family celebration. "Congratulations on the school district opportunity," he said formally. "It's exactly the kind of project that could establish Thompson Construction as a major regional contractor." "Thank you, Frank," I replied, offering him a glass of champagne. "We couldn't have gotten here without your expertise and support." Frank accepted the glass but did not drink immediately. Instead, he looked around the office that had been unchanged since our father's death, taking in the photographs of completed projects, the industry awards, and the family pictures that represented 3 generations of Thompson Construction history. "Your father would be proud," he said finally, his voice carrying genuine emotion for the first time since I had returned to Cedar Falls. He always believed that Thompson Construction could be something special with the right leadership and resources. He also believed that families are stronger when they work together, I replied, raising my glass in a toast. To Robert Thompson, who taught us that success is not just about building structures, but about building relationships that last. As we drank our champagne and planned for Thompson Construction's future, I realized that returning to Cedar Falls had given me something more valuable than business success or family reconciliation. It had shown me that true achievement comes not from individual accomplishments, but from using our talents and resources to create opportunities for others. The woman who had left Cedar Falls 10 years earlier as a failure had returned as someone with the power to transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. And that transformation had been possible only because I had learned to combine ambition with humility, success with service, and individual achievement with family loyalty. Thompson Construction's future was brighter than it had ever been. But more importantly, the Thompson family was whole again, united around a shared purpose that honored our father's memory while building something new for the next generation. Have you ever had to choose between personal success and family loyalty? Have you found ways to use your achievements to help the people you love? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more stories about family, business, and the complicated relationships between success and responsibility. Remember that sometimes coming home is not about returning to where you started, but about bringing everything you have learned back to the people who matter most. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it inspires you to find ways to bridge the gaps between ambition and belonging in your own life.